George Herriman had a secret, one that if anyone found out would likely destroy his entire life. But at the same time, he left numerous clues in his art to the very secret that he was so desperate to keep. And while he lived his life in hiding, he became one of the most influential artists in American history. Not comic artists, artists, period. So what was that secret? Well, if you don't already know, I'll tell you in a minute, but I want you to meet George Herriman as the world did. A mysterious man who arrived in New York City by train in the year 1900 with almost nothing to his name besides a burning desire to escape his past and to get a job in the newly established comic industry. His friends would imply he'd been a hobo, a drifter who showed up in the offices of newspaper comic editors looking for a job with grease stains still on his pants from hopping boxcars. And those editors had a lot of power because in 1900, working in comics was a big deal. This was before TV, movies, even commercial radio. Newspaper journalists were the big celebrities of the day, and the comic revolution was just taking off, largely because of one man, William Randolph Hearst. When you hear the name Hearst, you might think of the big business robber baron, the newspaper publishing empire, the man who inspired Citizen Kane. But one thing people tend to forget about Hearst is that he was like the world's first comic nerd. Growing up as a lonely little rich boy, Hearst became an avid comic collector and used his family's money to acquire comics from all over the world. And so when, as an adult, he began using his family's money to acquire newspaper publishing businesses across the country, his love of comics would be part of the reason for his success. Newspapers had traditionally been long columns of text, but as Hearst bought papers, he would fill them up with illustrations, cartoons, and recurring comic characters to give them more mass appeal. And as his newspaper empire grew, Hearst began collecting comic artists just like he'd collected comics as a kid. He convinced Thomas Nast to come out of retirement. He hired a talented young artist to knock off his favorite German comic. He even spent an enormous sum to poach the Yellow Kid. So, with Hearst's influence, comic strips were basically becoming the TV shows of the day, and comic artists were becoming rich and famous. And young George Herriman wanted in. Whether it was wealth, fame, or, as I suspect, something else that was driving him, he, like so many others, marched his portfolio up and down New York City to different newspapers until finally one of Hearst's editors gave him a chance and offered him a job. So Herriman finds himself in a busy New York bullpen, tasked with turning out illustrations, single-panel gags, and comic strips at an astounding pace. This was a noisy office building packed with some of the funniest people on the planet, creating pages and pages of comics, all while pulling pranks on each other and their bosses. But Herriman is a weird fit in this world. He's incredibly shy. He refuses to take his hat off and dislikes being photographed. He has a strange, drawling accent that the other cartoonists can't place, but do love to imitate. He's also brilliant. He's fluent in at least 3 languages, or maybe it's 5. He has an encyclopedic knowledge of literature, everything from Shakespeare to Don Quixote. But succeeding as a cartoonist meant having a recognizable style, a personal identity. But Herriman was a man living in constant fear that someone would discover his identity. So while he's able to get jobs by imitating the top artists of the day, he isn't able to hold down any position for very long. The real ticket to success is having a recurring character. A hit character would give an artist a steady paycheck as well as an outlet to express themselves. And Herriman is desperate not only financially, but also to find some outlet to express his true identity. And so, for the next few years, he tries repeatedly to come up with his own hit character. His first attempt is Musical Mose. And just fair warning that a lot of comics back then were racist. Musical Mose is a takeoff of popular minstrel stage shows at the time. The format is simple. Mose, a black man, tries to get jobs in various professions by disguising himself as other races before in the final panels being found out and beaten up for his attempts. It hasn't aged well and wasn't a hit at the time. After Mose, over the next few years, he puts out a variety of other characters, like Acrobatic Archie and Professor Otto and his Auto. Again, they're sort of derivative of other popular comics and trends of the day, and they fail to connect with audiences and end up canceled as well. And soon, with advances in photography, jobs are getting fewer for cartoonists. They're being pushed out of the major sections of the newspaper and back into the funny pages. Time is running out for Herriman to crack the code. And in Herriman's comics from this time, you can almost feel his yearning. The shy guy in the corner, desperate to fit in, but at the same time desperate to be himself, struggling to find his identity in this industry. So let's talk about Herriman's identity, because that story doesn't begin on his train ride to New York, but on another train ride he took when he was only 10 years old. He was riding with his parents and sister from his birthplace in New Orleans to the frontier town of Los Angeles, where the Herrimans were about to begin a new life passing as white. See, the Herriman family was one of mixed ancestry, the descendants of free people of color, slaves, slaveholders, and perhaps a number of other people. But at that time in America, any amount of black ancestry meant that society saw you as black. We don't know how Herriman thought about his own identity, but we do know that when he was born, society labeled him as black. But now the Herrimans had cut all ties with their family to start a new life in Los Angeles. George and his sister would be enrolled in a whites-only school. As an adult, Herriman would mark himself as white on census forms. When he bought his house, he would sign the required covenants agreeing never to sell that house to a black person. And when he came to work in comics, he hid his background, just as he hid his curly hair under the hat that he refused to take off. While we can't know what that experience was like for him, I believe there are clues in his work. Look back at Musical Moe's, his first attempt to create a hit character. What might have seemed like stock racist minstrel humor was, I believe, both an attempt to create a popular black fictional character by whatever means society allowed, as well as an embodiment of the very real fear of violence he must have felt at potentially being found out. See, I don't think Herriman got into comics for fame and fortune so much as he was trying to find some way to express his own identity after decades of hiding. And now, after 14 years of searching, he was about to figure it out. The latest of his many attempts at a mainstream strip was called The Dingbat Family, a kind of stock family sitcom. But what's most interesting about The Dingbat Family is what's happening down here. Herriman began adding little dramas about a cat and mouse in the corner of each strip. Eventually, Herriman would use some of the space he was allotted for the Dingbat Family to run an entire mini strip following the adventures of the cat and mouse, who eventually get the names Krazy Kat and Ignatz Mouse. In one day, history is made. The office boy at the paper is walking by and tells Herriman that he likes the cat and mouse more than the Dingbat Family. Inspired, Herriman launches Krazy Kat and Ignatz Mouse into their own daily strip. And here, finally, is the seed that would grow into one of the greatest comics in American history. And perhaps more importantly, it was finally a means for Herriman to express himself. The premise of Krazy Kat is simple. The black cat is in love with the white mouse. The mouse doesn't like the cat and throws a brick at the cat's head. The cat sees the brick as a sign of the mouse's affection and swoons after him. But it's the execution of this simple premise that makes Krazy Kat so special. Herriman brings all of his linguistic knowledge to bear, creating this wild dialect that's a combination of New York Yiddish, Creole patois, French, English, Spanish, with a little Shakespeare sprinkled on top for good measure. But that Krazy Kat daily strip was just the beginning, because while it was a moderate success, Krazy Kat had gained one very important fan, William Randolph Hearst. And so, Hearst gives Herriman a full page in his Sunday papers to expand Krazy Kat. And what Herriman does on these Sunday pages is absolutely spectacular. If you were to say they were the best works ever published in the medium of comics to this day, I'm not sure I'd argue with you. He takes that space and just breaks the entire medium of comics wide open. Again, the speech bubble is only like 25 years old. Comic books and superheroes wouldn't exist for almost another 20 years, and already Herriman is just stripping the entire medium down to the bolts and rebuilding it every single week. Some weeks, it's an entirely horizontal layout. Sometimes it's vertical. Panels take on odd shapes and sizes. The backgrounds, inspired by his trips to Arizona, shift and morph. Yet, through all of it, the storytelling, the action is crisp, clear, and concise. I've talked in past videos about how American comics often lack the fluidity of Japanese comics, but Herriman is one of the most natural, fluid storytellers to ever live. I mean, look at this early masterpiece, an entirely silent saga of cat and mouse bouncing on the seas. It almost seems to come alive and turn into animation on the page. You might call it cinematic, except that movies at the time looked like this. This isn't comics borrowing from movies, it's Herriman inventing the visual language that movies would eventually copy and then be given credit for inventing. As for the story of Krazy Kat, it gets deeper, but not much. A police officer dog is added into the mix and also eventually falls in love with the mouse. The cat's gender shifts from week to week, but that simple, sometimes homosexual, sadomasochistic love triangle poses endless variations for Herriman. It's pretty weird stuff, and so the editors of the comic pages don't want to carry it. But Hearst isn't going to stop printing it, so he forces the editors of the intellectual sections of his newspapers to take it on, running it alongside art reviews and high-minded writing. And the intellectuals embrace it. This is groundbreaking. This little tale of cat and mouse is the first comic that is beginning to be seen as serious art. A seminal book on American art dedicates a whole chapter to Krazy Kat. Herriman is recognized as an artist of importance by Vanity Fair. Comics are finally beginning to be recognized as an art form, and pretty much everyone agrees that George Herriman is its leading practitioner. But no one seemed to guess that so much of the power of his work, as well as his withdrawn demeanor, derived from the fact that George Herriman was living in fear, succeeding in a world which would reject him if they ever found out the truth of his heritage. So, despite all of that critical success, Herriman remained shy, withdrawn, and exceedingly humble. He talks down about himself constantly. Apparently, when he was offered a raise, he turned it down too. Perhaps he didn't want to raise his profile and risk discovery, or perhaps he was just happy to have an outlet to express himself, because the pages of Krazy Kat seemed to be the one place in his entire life where he could truly be open and wrestle with his own identity. And it's just so tragic, the dichotomy between the sad man and the happy comic, the man who needed to keep his identity secret at all costs, but was so desperate to live his truth that he risked it all to put numerous references and clues into Krazy Kat. We'll look at specific examples of those clues at the end of this video, but let's get back to the story. Because after a few years, like all things, Krazy Kat's popularity cools off. Another mouse, created by a vocal Herriman fan named Walt Disney, is pioneering the new medium of animation, taking some inspiration, and some might say more than a little inspiration, from Herriman. His little animal comic was becoming a relic of the past. That dwindling readership would usually mean cancellation, but Hearst, ever the Krazy Kat supporter, had apparently given Herriman a lifetime contract, and so Herriman kept at it. But in one late interview, Herriman said he wasn't sure they were even printing it anymore. And sadly, he wasn't far from the truth. While the top comics would appear in over 1,000 newspapers, Krazy Kat was running in only 37. A fellow cartoonist described Herriman as the saddest man he ever met. It doesn't seem that he ever told anyone the truth of his origins. The man who so clearly just wanted the chance to be himself died without ever getting that opportunity. And for a while, it seemed that no one would ever know his truth, because Herriman was being forgotten. Less than 10 people attended his funeral. His original art was being used to plug up leaks in the newspaper offices where he had worked. But his story doesn't end there, because his vocal fans were not going to allow the world to forget George Herriman. One famous fan, the poet E. E. Cummings, made it a mission to get a bound volume of strips published. And so, 2 years after Herriman's death, a collected edition of Krazy Kat finally appears. It contained only 200 of the thousands and thousands of strips Herriman produced, but it was a start. And that little book would pass between artists, writers, filmmakers. It found its way into the hands of Charles Schulz and became one of the major influences on Peanuts. Many others were likely introduced to Herriman by this volume. Robert Crumb, Chuck Jones, Will Eisner, Bill Watterson, Art Spiegelman all talk about Herriman's influence. It's almost easier to list who wasn't influenced by Herriman. And so, by the 1970s, Herriman had earned enough critical praise to be included in an upcoming dictionary. And after some diligent research, the researcher working on his entry found something no one else had: George Herriman's birth certificate, which listed him as Black. There had been no question that he was a profound genius in the art of comics, but now, finally, 27 years after his death, the world was ready and able to see George Herriman more fully, as I believe he so desperately wanted us to see him. And while it is so tragic that he lived his life in hiding and in fear, he left us, more than 100 years later, a beautiful and profound record of his experiences. Because every day, for 31 years, George Herriman drew the story of a black cat who yearned for a white mouse, only to receive a brick in the face for his love. And while I strongly encourage you to check out Krazy Kat for yourself, and I'll put a few links down below, I'll share a few of the specific episodes that began to be reevaluated in the light of this discovery. They're Krazy's attempt to straighten her tail to appear more attractive to the mouse. And there's the famous episode in which Krazy Kat gets dyed white, and finally the mouse falls in love with her. And in one Sunday strip, Herriman reveals Krazy's origin. Krazy's ancestor is reminded by her father, "Remember, my child, you are a cat of Egypt, and so you hold the respect of the world." Thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, you can really help out by liking, commenting, subscribing, and sharing it with a friend or on social media. And finally, big shout out to Michael Tisserand, whose biography of Herriman formed the backbone of my research for this video. And I also recommend you pick it up if you want to dive deeper into Herriman's story. Thanks so much, and I'll see you guys soon.